I'd like to thank the Vedic Cultural Society for the invitation to speak to you tonight about my book, Forbidden Archeology, which gives a Vedic perspective on human origins and antiquity. So, first of all, I'd like to introduce myself as a researcher in history and philosophy of science for the Bhaktivedanta Institute. And that is the science studies branch of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. The purpose of the Institute is to study concepts of modern science in light of India's timeless Vedic wisdom. So the talk I'm going to give tonight is based on talks that I've given at the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and other scientific institutions, conferences, and universities throughout the world. My research into human origins and antiquity is guided by my studies in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India. And these writings tell us that human civilizations have come and gone on this planet for vast periods of cyclical time. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about this Vedic concept of cyclical time, you could consult this paper, which I presented at the World Archeological Congress, and it was later published in a peer-reviewed conference proceedings volume. The basic unit of Vedic cyclical time is called the day of Brahma, or the Kalpa. This day of Brahma lasts for 4,320,000,000 years. It's followed by a night of Brahma, which also lasts for 4,320,000,000 years. And the days follow the nights endlessly in succession. And during the days of Brahma, life, including human life, is manifest in the universe, and during the nights, life is dormant. Now, if we carefully study the Vedic cosmological calendar, we'll see that the current day of Brahma, the one we're in right now, began about 2 billion years ago. So a Vedic archaeologist might expect to find evidence for a human presence going back almost 2 billion years. Now, the ancient Vedic writings also speak of ape men. The idea of ape men wasn't invented by European scientists of the 19th century. Long before that, the authors of these ancient Sanskrit writings were speaking of such things. But they also tell us that alongside these ape men existed human beings like us. So the basic picture that you get is one of coexistence, not evolution. And the period of coexistence goes very, very, very far back in time. Of course, these ideas are somewhat different from the ideas about human origins and antiquity that we get from Charles Darwin and his modern followers. Actually, a friend of mine from India told me recently, said, "Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin. You've had to come back to correct your mistake." So I don't know if I can do it in one lifetime. It may take me a few hundred or so, but maybe you can help me out a little bit. So what do the Darwinists tell us about human origins? Well, first of all, they say that life began on Earth between 2 and 3 billion years ago. Some scientists say they can detect chemical signs of life going back about 3 billion years. But the oldest undisputed fossil evidence for life that paleontologists now have, fossils of undisputed single-celled creatures, go back about 2 billion years, which is, interestingly enough, the beginning of the day of Brahma. Then they say the first primates, the first apes and monkeys, came into existence about 40 million years ago. Then they say the first hominids, the first ape men, came into existence about 6 million years ago. And finally, they say that humans of our type, anatomically modern humans, came into existence about 100,000 years ago. At least that's the age of the oldest undisputed fossil evidence for anatomically modern humans in terms of what modern archaeologists think is true. And they say all of the physical evidence supports this evolutionary picture of human origins, with human beings like us coming into existence between 100 or 150,000 years ago, something like that. But when I did 8 years of research into the entire history of archaeology, I found something quite different. I found that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have discovered huge amounts of evidence showing that humans like us have existed throughout this entire period of time, going all the way back to the very beginning of the history of life on Earth. This evidence takes the form of anatomically modern human skeletal remains, anatomically modern human footprints, and human artifacts of various kinds. I've documented this evidence in this book, Forbidden Archaeology, co-authored with my co-author, Richard Thompson. It's a 900-page book, basically aimed at the scientific world. The book is also available in a shorter, popular edition, which is also available in French. It's been published in French in Europe by the publisher Rocher, so you could get it on, if you like French, if you prefer French as your primary language. It's available on the French Amazon.com. Now, this evidence for extreme human antiquity, which contradicts the current theories, is not very well known, both within the scientific world and to the public at large, because of what I call a process of knowledge filtration that operates in the world of science. We can call this blue box here the knowledge filter, and it represents the current consensus on human origins. And reports of evidence that conform to this consensus will pass through this social and intellectual filter very easily, which means students will read about this evidence in their textbooks. People will hear scientists speaking about it on television. If they go to the local museum of natural history, they'll see the artifacts and bones on display. But if we have reports that radically contradict this current consensus, they tend to be filtered out of the discussion, which means we don't read about this evidence in our textbooks, we don't hear scientists speaking very much about it, and if we go to the museum, we won't see the artifacts or bones on display, although they may be there somewhere in the museum collection. And I'm not talking here about some satanic conspiracy theory. It's a very well-known, established fact among historians, philosophers, and sociologists of science that theory determines how evidence is treated. And what I've simply done is demonstrate how that process operates in archaeology and human origin studies generally. So what I'd like to do now is give a few representative examples of the kinds of evidence that I'm talking about. I want to show two things. First of all, that this evidence actually does exist, and I also want to say something about how the knowledge filtering process operates in each case. So I'm going to start with evidence that's relatively close to what many scientists are now prepared to accept in terms of human antiquity, and then gradually we'll go back further and further and further in time. And some of these, as I said, this knowledge filtering process has been going on for a long time. So some of the cases I'm going to talk about are from the more recent history of archaeology. Some of the cases will be from the earlier history of archaeology. This is Virginia Steen McIntyre. She's an American geologist who I know personally. When she was a young woman, just beginning her career in archaeology, she was involved in dating an archaeological site in Mexico called Huayatlaco, which is near the town of Puebla in central Mexico. There, some American archaeologists discovered these artifacts and others like them. And they may look primitive to us, but according to archaeologists, artifacts of this type are made only by anatomically modern humans, not by any kind of ape man. The excavation was conducted by archaeologist Cynthia Irwin Williams. She conducted a very professional excavation up to all the modern standards. The artifacts were photographed in place when they were discovered, such as this one here. And here is a close-up of it, solidly embedded in the rock, indicating it was an original part of those deposits. Now, of course, the archaeologists want to know how old these implements were. So they called in a team of geologists to date the site, and in that team was Virginia Steen McIntyre. So she and her colleagues used 4 different methods to date the site. In the same layer as the artifacts, animal bones with butchering marks were found. That's another indication of a human presence. So they used the uranium series method to date those bones, and they used 2 different uranium series methods, and the protactinium method gave an age of greater than 100,000 years. The thorium age was 245,000 years. Directly above the layer in which the animal bones and the human artifacts were found was a layer of volcanic ash. So the geologists used the zircon fission track method to date that layer of ash, and they got an age of 270,000 years, which means the animal bones and human artifacts below that layer had to be at least that old. They also used a method called tetrahydration. This is based on the fact that volcanic crystals over time gradually absorb water molecules, and the water molecules begin to fill up little vesicles or air bubbles in the crystals. And by measuring the amount of water that accumulates in the crystals, you can get some idea of the age of the ash. And the age they got using that method was consistent with the methods they got using the zircon fission track method and the uranium series method. And finally, they used standard stratigraphic evidence. The artifact layers were at about 10 meters deep in terms of the landscape there, and they could determine by studying the geology of the region that the site had originally been covered by another 50 meters of sediment. So they calculated how long, studying the hydrogeology of the area, how long it would have taken to erode, those 50 meters down to the present level. And again, that age was consistent with the ages obtained by the other methods. So the geologist, Virginia Steen McIntyre, and her colleagues concluded that the age of the site was at least 250,000 years, and they considered that a very conservative estimate. The archaeologists absolutely refused to accept this date. They said, that's impossible. Human beings capable of making these artifacts did not exist anywhere in the world 250,000 years ago because they hadn't evolved yet. And what to speak of being present in North America, because the current consensus is that you have no human beings entering North America until 20,000 years ago maximum. And most, the current consensus is actually around 15,000 years. So they absolutely refused to publish the date for the site given by their own team of geologists that they themselves called in to date the site. Now when Virginia Steen McIntyre and some of her colleagues independently published the date for the site, she found herself in big trouble. A rumor campaign was started. People were calling her a maverick, a publicity seeker, a troublemaker. She lost a teaching position that she held at a university in the United States because of this publication. And she also suddenly found that all of her opportunities for advancement in the United States Geological Survey were suddenly blocked off.